There's a strange moment that almost everyone experiences at some point in life. The moment you begin to change. Not small changes, like a new hobby or a new routine, but the kind of change that alters who you are. You start setting boundaries. You stop explaining yourself. You begin saying no without guilt. You become quieter, calmer, more certain of your own direction. And suddenly, something unsettling happens. The same people who once supported you start acting differently. Their tone changes. Their patience disappears. Their warmth slowly turns into criticism, sarcasm, or distance. The friend who once laughed with you now calls you different. The family member who once praised you suddenly says you've changed too much. Even people who claim to care about you begin treating your growth like a problem. At first, it doesn't make sense. After all, you're not hurting anyone. You're simply becoming a stronger version of yourself. So why does your improvement make people uncomfortable? Why does your confidence trigger resentment? And why does the moment you finally start becoming yourself often become the moment people start hating you? Carl Jung believed the answer has nothing to do with jealousy, arrogance, or misunderstanding. It has everything to do with something far deeper, a hidden psychological system that most people spend their entire lives trapped inside without ever realizing it. Before we understand why people react so strongly to your change, we have to look at something most people never notice. Every relationship in your life operates on an invisible agreement, a psychological contract, not the kind that's written or spoken out loud, but one that slowly forms through years of repeated behavior. Over time, people begin to expect a certain version of you. The agreeable friend, the supportive partner, the quiet sibling, the dependable co-worker, the person who listens more than they speak, the one who keeps the peace. And the longer you play that role, the more permanent it becomes in the minds of others. Without realizing it, people start organizing their expectations around that version of you. They assume you'll always be the one who understands, always the one who forgives, always the one who stays calm when others lose control. In other words, they stop seeing you as a changing human being. They start seeing you as a stable function in their life, a predictable piece in the social system. And predictability is extremely valuable in human relationships, because predictable people are comfortable. They're easy to understand, easy to influence, easy to rely on. But the moment you begin to grow, something subtle happens. You stop reacting the way you used to. You stop apologizing for things that were never your fault. You stop tolerating disrespect. You stop sacrificing your peace just to keep others comfortable. And when that happens, the invisible contract breaks. The role people assign to you suddenly disappears. The agreeable friend becomes assertive. The quiet person starts speaking honestly. The endlessly patient one finally sets limits. From your perspective, this is growth. But from the perspective of the people around you, the system has just been disrupted, because the version of you they built their expectations around is no longer there. And when that version disappears, many people experience something they don't fully understand. Not confusion, not curiosity, but discomfort. A deep psychological discomfort that often turns into criticism, resistance, or even resentment. To understand why this reaction happens, Carl Jung pointed to something even deeper inside the human psyche, something he called the persona. Carl Jung believed that every person carries a social mask, a version of themselves designed not to express who they truly are, but to be accepted by the world around them. He called this mask the persona. From the outside, the persona looks natural. It feels like personality. But in reality, it is something far more strategic, a psychological role we slowly build in order to survive socially. As children, we quickly learn which parts of ourselves are welcomed and which parts are rejected. When you are quiet and obedient, you are praised. When you express anger, you are told to calm down. When you question authority, you are labeled difficult. When you show too much ambition, you are called arrogant. Little by little, the psyche adapts. You begin emphasizing the traits that earn approval and hiding the traits that make others uncomfortable. Over time, this adaptation becomes automatic. You become the polite version of yourself at work, the agreeable version around friends, the responsible version with family, and eventually, something subtle happens. The mask becomes so familiar that even you start believing it is who you truly are. But Jung warned that the persona is not the real self. It is a social performance, a carefully shaped identity that allows us to function smoothly inside society. And as long as the persona remains stable, relationships remain stable too. People know how to deal with you. They understand the role you play in their lives. But the moment you begin to grow, evolve, or question that role, the mask starts to crack. And when the persona begins to break, something unsettling occurs. The people around you don't just notice the change, they feel it. Because whether they realize it or not, they weren't only relating to you as a person, they were relating to the mask you wore, the predictable version of you, the one who fit neatly into their expectations. And the moment that mask begins to disappear, the dynamic between you and them starts to shift in ways that can make people deeply uncomfortable. This is where the real tension begins, because when the persona collapses, something far more powerful starts to emerge from underneath it. The breaking of the mask rarely happens in one dramatic moment. It begins quietly, almost invisibly. At first, the change is small. You start noticing things you used to ignore. A comment that once seemed harmless now feels disrespectful. A request that once felt normal now feels unfair. A conversation that once drained you suddenly becomes unbearable. For the first time, you begin asking a dangerous question. Why have I been tolerating this? And once that question appears, something inside you begins to shift. You start setting small boundaries, nothing extreme. You simply say no when something doesn't feel right. You stop apologizing for things that were never your responsibility. You stop explaining every decision in order to be understood. The change is subtle but powerful, because for the first time, your behavior is no longer organized around keeping everyone else comfortable. It is organized around protecting your own peace. At first, people barely notice. They assume it's temporary. Maybe you're stressed. Maybe you're having a bad week. Maybe you'll go back to being the version of yourself they're used to. But then the pattern continues. You keep the boundary. You stay calm instead of reacting. You walk away from situations that once trapped you. And that's when something important begins to happen. The people who benefited from your old behavior start feeling uneasy. Not because you've done something wrong, but because the advantages they once had are slowly disappearing. The friend who relied on your endless patience now faces resistance. The co-worker who depended on your compliance now meets limits. The family member who used guilt to control you suddenly loses their leverage. From your perspective, you are simply becoming healthier. But from their perspective, the rules of the relationship have changed, and human beings are deeply uncomfortable when familiar systems stop working. Because the old version of you was predictable. They knew exactly how you would respond. They knew how far they could push. They knew which buttons worked. But now, those buttons no longer produce the same reactions. And when that happens, people instinctively try to restore the old balance, sometimes through persuasion, sometimes through guilt, and sometimes through something much darker, resentment. At first, the reaction is subtle, a small comment here, a sarcastic joke there, a strange tension in conversations that once felt effortless. But over time, the discomfort becomes harder to ignore. People begin treating your growth as if it's a problem. They say you've become too serious, too distant, too proud, too different. And the strange part is, many of them genuinely believe it, because when you change, you unknowingly trigger several powerful psychological forces inside the people around you. For Carl Jung, these reactions were not random. They followed predictable patterns rooted deep in the human psyche. And once you see these patterns, the behavior of others begins to make a disturbing kind of sense. The first reason people begin resisting the new you is simple. Your growth exposes their stagnation. When someone close to you starts evolving, it creates a mirror. Suddenly, your discipline highlights their procrastination. Your boundaries reveal their lack of self-respect. Your independence exposes their dependence. And mirrors are uncomfortable. Most people prefer environments where everyone grows at the same pace, or not at all. Because when no one changes, no one has to confront their own limitations. But the moment you begin improving yourself, you disrupt that silent agreement. Your transformation becomes evidence that change is possible, and that realization quietly pressures everyone around you. Instead of asking themselves difficult questions about their own lives, many people choose a simpler solution. They criticize the person who changed. The second reason is loss of control. Many relationships operate on patterns that are never openly discussed. Certain people become the peacemaker. Others become the decision maker. Some become the emotional caretaker. When you were the one who always forgave, always listened, always adjusted, the system worked. But when you stop reacting the same way, the entire structure begins to wobble. The person who once relied on your patience suddenly faces resistance. The person who manipulated your guilt suddenly finds it ineffective. And when people lose control in a relationship, they often react defensively. They may accuse you of changing too much, of becoming selfish, of abandoning the person you used to be. But what they are really reacting to is the disappearance of a dynamic that once benefited them. The third reason is ego disruption. Some relationships survive only because one person constantly feeds the ego of the other. The friend who always needs validation, the partner who always needs reassurance, the colleague who always needs recognition. When you were more agreeable, you played that role automatically. You reassured them, you validated them, you kept their self-image stable. But when you start focusing on your own path, that stream of validation dries up. And for someone who depends on external affirmation, this feels like rejection. Not because you've become cruel, but because you've stopped revolving around their emotional needs. The fourth reason is unpredictability. Human beings are deeply comforted by predictability. When someone behaves in consistent ways, we build expectations around them. We know what to say, what to avoid, and how far we can push. But when a person changes, those expectations collapse. The quiet friend becomes assertive. The forgiving partner becomes firm. The accommodating co-worker begins setting limits. Suddenly, people are no longer sure how to interact with you. And uncertainty creates anxiety. Many people would rather criticize someone for changing than adjust to a new dynamic. The fifth, and perhaps most painful reason is this. Many people are not attached to who you truly are. They are attached to who you used to be. The version of you that made their life easier. The version that tolerated things you no longer accept. So when that version disappears, they experience something similar to loss. They are not mourning you. They are mourning the role you used to play. And sometimes, the easiest way for them to cope with that loss is to convince themselves that the new version of you is the problem. But from Jung's perspective, this moment of conflict is not a mistake. It is a sign that something profound is happening inside your psyche. Because when the old mask breaks and the old roles collapse, you begin entering one of the most important psychological processes a human being can experience. A process Jung called individuation. Carl Jung believed that the tension you experience when you start changing is not just a social problem. It is part of a much deeper psychological process, a process he called individuation. Individuation is the journey of becoming who you truly are, not the version of you that was shaped by expectations approval, or fear of rejection, but the version that emerges when you begin listening to your own inner voice. For most of life, people live according to what Jung called the collective expectations of society. We learn how to behave by observing what is rewarded and what is punished. Be agreeable, be polite, don't challenge authority, don't stand out too much. Over time, these expectations form an invisible psychological script, and without realizing it, most people spend their lives acting out that script. But individuation begins the moment a person starts questioning it. The moment you ask yourself, who am I when I stop trying to please everyone else? That question is dangerous, because once it appears, the old structure of your identity begins to loosen. You start paying attention to parts of yourself that were previously ignored. Your real opinions, your real boundaries, your real desires. And when you begin expressing those things, your behavior changes. You stop saying yes when you mean no. You stop apologizing for your values. You stop shrinking yourself to avoid making others uncomfortable. To the outside world, this transformation can look abrupt. People might say you've become cold, or distant, or selfish. But from Jung's perspective, something entirely different is happening. The false self is dissolving, and the authentic self is beginning to emerge. The problem is that individuation rarely happens quietly, because when one person starts stepping outside the expectations of the collective, it disrupts the balance of the social group. The family that once relied on your compliance must now adjust. The friendships that depended on your constant availability must now evolve. The relationships that thrived on old dynamics must now face new realities. And not everyone is willing to make that adjustment. Some people prefer the comfort of the old system, the predictable roles, the familiar version of you that made everything easier. So when individuation begins, resistance often appears, sometimes subtly, sometimes aggressively. But Jung believed this resistance was not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is a sign that you are stepping outside the psychological patterns that once defined you. In other words, you are becoming an individual. And the moment a person begins that journey, something else inevitably appears. A quiet psychological conflict that unfolds beneath the surface of everyday interactions. A kind of invisible tension between the person you are becoming and the system that once depended on who you used to be. Once individuation begins, the conflict around you rarely appears as open hostility. Most of the time, it shows up in subtle ways. Small shifts in behavior that are easy to dismiss at first. A joke that feels slightly sharper than usual. A comment that sounds supportive on the surface, but carries a hidden sting. A strange tension in conversations that were once effortless. It's as if something unspoken has entered the relationship. Because when you change, people instinctively try to restore the version of reality they were comfortable with. And they do this in ways that are often unconscious. One of the most common reactions is subtle criticism. People begin pointing out flaws that never seemed to bother them before. You've become too serious. You're overthinking things. You used to be more fun. On the surface, these comments sound harmless, but their real purpose is often to pull you back toward the version of yourself that was easier to deal with. Another common reaction is guilt. Someone might say, "You've changed. You don't care about people like you used to." Or, "You're acting like you're better than everyone now." These statements are not really about understanding your growth. They are attempts to reactivate the emotional triggers that once kept you compliant. Because if guilt works, the old dynamic returns. Then there is emotional manipulation. The person who once relied on your patience may suddenly create crises when you set boundaries. The friend who depended on your constant availability may accuse you of abandoning them. The family member who once controlled you through obligation may remind you of everything they've done for you. All of these reactions share one goal: to restore the psychological balance that existed before you changed. Carl Jung observed that human relationships often organize themselves into stable emotional systems. Each person unconsciously occupies a role. When one person changes their behavior, the entire system becomes unstable, and instability makes people anxious, so they attempt to correct it, sometimes through persuasion, sometimes through pressure, sometimes through conflict. But the most revealing sign of this hidden psychological struggle is something much quieter: a growing distance. People who once felt comfortable around you begin to withdraw, not necessarily because they hate you, but because they no longer understand where they stand with you. The emotional rules of the relationship have changed, and many people would rather step away than adapt to a new dynamic. At first, this distance can feel painful. You may wonder if you've done something wrong, if you've become too rigid, too distant, too different. But Jung believed that this tension is an unavoidable stage in psychological development, because when you stop living according to the expectations of others, you inevitably disrupt the emotional patterns that once defined your relationships. And that disruption often leads to something that many people fear more than criticism, conflict, or misunderstanding. It leads to loneliness. One of the hardest truths about personal transformation is that growth often creates distance, not because you want it to, but because the person you are becoming no longer fits easily into the spaces you once occupied. When you begin individuating, your priorities start shifting. Conversations that once felt exciting begin to feel repetitive. Situations you once tolerated begin to feel draining. Dynamics you once accepted begin to feel misaligned. And slowly, almost quietly, some relationships begin to fade. The friend who only connected with the old version of you stops reaching out. The group that thrived on shared habits no longer feels like home. The people who once understood you now seem strangely distant. At first, this can feel deeply unsettling. You may question whether you've made a mistake, whether becoming stronger somehow made you colder, whether setting boundaries pushed people away. But what Jung observed in many individuals going through psychological transformation is that this stage of isolation is often unavoidable, because individuation is not simply about discovering who you are. It is also about separating from identities that were never truly yours, and separation always carries a cost. Some people will not recognize the person you are becoming. Others will feel uncomfortable with the boundaries you now maintain. And a few will quietly drift away because the role you once played in their lives no longer exists. This can create a sense of loneliness that feels different from ordinary loneliness. It is not the loneliness of having no one around you. It is the loneliness of standing in a space between two identities, the person you used to be and the person you are becoming. Jung believed this phase is where many people turn back. The discomfort becomes too heavy, the silence too unfamiliar. So they return to the old mask. They shrink themselves again. They restore the dynamics that once kept everyone comfortable. But those who continue forward eventually discover something important. The distance created by growth does not only remove the wrong relationships, it also creates space for something new. Because not everyone is meant to meet the person you are becoming. And the people who cannot accept your transformation often leave before that new chapter begins, which leads to a realization that many people never expect. Sometimes the very thing that feels like rejection is actually protection. At first, being disliked feels like failure. You notice the distance in someone's voice, the subtle criticism, the feeling that the room becomes slightly colder when you walk in. And a part of you wonders if you made a mistake, if maybe you should have stayed the same, stayed easier to deal with, more agreeable, less complicated. But over time, something begins to reveal itself. You start noticing a strange pattern. The people who resent the new version of you are often the same people who benefited the most from the old one, the ones who relied on your patience without offering their own. The ones who expected your understanding but rarely tried to understand you. The ones who were comfortable when you made yourself smaller. In other words, their approval was never based on who you truly were. It was based on how well you played a role that served them. And once that role disappears, their approval disappears with it. This is the hidden gift of being disliked. It reveals which relationships were built on authenticity and which ones were built on convenience. Because when you stop performing, something powerful happens. The people who only valued your compliance begin to lose interest, but the people who value your truth begin to see you more clearly than ever before. The dynamic changes. Your circle may become smaller, but it becomes more honest. The conversations become deeper. The relationships become more balanced. Respect replaces obligation. Understanding replaces performance. Jung believed that authenticity naturally filters relationships in this way. Not everyone is capable of relating to the real you. Some people can only connect with the persona, the mask. And when the mask disappears, so does their interest. But this is not loss, it is clarification. Because the approval you lose was never rooted in your real self. And the connections that remain are no longer sustained by roles or expectations. They are sustained by something much rarer, mutual recognition. The recognition of two individuals who are no longer pretending to be someone else. When people say you've changed, they're often right. You have changed, but not in the way they think. You haven't become colder. You haven't become selfish, and you certainly haven't become arrogant. What has changed is something far more unsettling to the people around you. You stop performing. You stop shaping your behavior around expectations that were never truly yours. You stopped asking for permission to exist as the person you are becoming. And when that happens, the people who were attached to the old version of you often struggle to understand the shift, because in their minds, the person they knew has disappeared. But the truth is simpler. That person never fully existed in the first place. It was a role, a mask shaped by habit, approval, and the quiet pressure to belong. Carl Jung believed that the process of becoming yourself inevitably disrupts the psychological systems you once lived inside. The roles change, the expectations collapse, and the relationships built on those expectations must either transform or fall away. So when someone tells you that you've changed, the real question isn't whether they're right. The real question is this: were they connected to who you truly are, or to the version of you that made their life easier? Because the moment you stop performing for the world is the moment something powerful begins. You finally discover which connections were built on the mask, and which ones can survive without it. So if you've made it this far, you already understand something most people never realize. When you change, resistance is inevitable. Some people will misunderstand you. Some will criticize you. Some will quietly walk away. But what you gain in return is far more valuable. You gain clarity. You begin to see which relationships were built on roles, and which ones are strong enough to survive your authenticity. You stop performing, and for the first time, your life begins to align with who you actually are. But this realization creates a new challenge. Once the mask falls away, the real question becomes, who are you when you stop living for approval? That's the deeper work Jung called individuation.